Does God exist? Are science and faith enemies? Your host for this series was an atheist who became a believer in God through his studies in science. Here is science teacher John Clayton.
In our previous presentation, we talked about what the conflict sources are for the problems between faith and science. We began by looking at the question of what has happened with the new atheism. The aggressiveness, the flow of books that have reached the bestseller lists, material by people like Dawkins and Harris and other writers who have written very well, who are well recognized in some cases, like Dawkins. Dawkins recognized as an outstanding biologist, but unfortunately has moved into fields that he has very little knowledge of. And as a result of that, books like The God Delusion are rather weak. And I mentioned the Alistair McGrath book, The Dawkins Delusion, as a response to that, and that even atheists are embarrassed by some of the things that have happened in that area. So the new atheism is an aggressive force, but it's impacting our kids. The media on the web has influenced young people very, very strongly in this area. There are many, many atheist websites. They tend to quote one another. They tend to quote people like Harris and Dawkins. They frequently are quite abusive, quite derogatory. But one of the things that happens with them is that they move young people into areas that they really don't understand the implications of. There's a thing called the blasphemy challenge, for example, in which young people are encouraged to blaspheme God, and it is then posted on the web as a support for the atheistic viewpoints and these statements. They're full of bad theology and they're full of bad science. We want to talk about bad science now, and then we want to talk about bad theology a little bit later. But what is involved in bad science? Well, we've already mentioned the fact that bad science is science that cannot be tested, that cannot be falsified. That does not mean that it has to be something that you can actually do with test tubes and meter sticks and balances and things of this type. But there has to be some kind of way that it can be examined historically, experimentally, or in other ways to verify that in fact the proposal does have credulence. Now, what has happened has been that the new science has been confused with things that are really not very good science at all. Quantum mechanics is a valid science. There are experiments that can be done. There are things that can be actually studied, that can be looked at, actual cause and effect things that can be examined, and we will talk about that in a later DVD. So I don't want you to feel that in this discussion we are denigrating the new science. The discoveries being made are amazing. The human genome has wonderful potential to do great things. Cloning can help us to cure cancer, to solve world food problems. There are wonderful new things happening in the new science. But there are things that are confused with the new science. And in cosmology, this has been a particular issue. In our first presentation, we pointed out that there are a series of logical choices that can be addressed scientifically. Was there a beginning? That can be approached scientifically. Evidence can be offered. Experiments can be conducted. Observations can be made. Was that beginning caused or was it not caused? That's something that can be approached by looking at the laws of thermodynamics, by understanding some things about the nature of our observation of the world around us. And what was the nature of that cause? And if you recall, if you have watched these, and if you haven't, I would strongly encourage you to do this. We talked about the fact that for time and space to have been created, as the Big Bang Theory, for example, suggests it was, the cause has to be something outside of time and space. Now, that doesn't automatically suggest it has to be God. And so what has happened has been that there have been proposals that attempt to avoid the God issue and to suggest instead that there are possible other things that could explain the creation of time and space and matter energy. String theory, brain theory, that's B-R-A-N-E. Multiple universes, parallel universes, virtual universes. Now, there are experiments that can be conducted in certain areas of these. But what is being proposed in these situations is that there are things that exist in higher dimensions which have some way interacted to create time and space and the world in which we live. String theory, for example, suggests that there are little entities out there which are called superstrings. They're said to have 11 dimensions. Some models say 10. And that these strings, when they interact with each other, are capable of producing time and space and energy, that they are the source of everything that we see in the physical world. Brain theory is very, very similar. Now, what's going on in these proposals is that 11-dimensional mathematics is being applied. There are equations in cosmology that when you solve the equations, give you certain suggestions that might be consistent with more than the 4-dimensional space-time that we see. See, we have X, and we have Y, and we have Z, and we have time. So we have 4 dimensions. In the discussion of flatland, back in the programs that we did in the earlier DVDs, we talked about how difficult it would be to understand something that exists outside of our XYZ time frame of reference. But the equations give us the capacity to do this. The equations, the mathematics, enable us to predict when there might be other dimensions involved. But do the equations suggest something that is testable? What you could do is you could test the result of what those equations might suggest. How many possible solutions are there, for instance, to the string theory equations? The answer is 10 to the 500th power. Now understand, that's 1, and then you start writing zeros, as you see on the screen right now. And you write them until you have 500 zeros out there. That many equations. Are any of those equations correct? We have no way of knowing. Are there more than one result that could come from any one equation? Well, the nature of mathematics would suggest that. Would there be perhaps multiple equations that could describe the same situation? Well, certainly that is always true in mathematics. So is it testable? Is it falsifiable? Does it comprise what we call good science? Or is it simply an exercise in philosophy that really will never be testable because of the complexity involved and because it is describing something that exists in dimensions that we can never conduct experiments or be a part of? There have been several books that have been written suggesting that string theory is really not good science. But I want to emphasize, these are approaches by scientists who are raising issues about the credibility of this type of an approach, because it is bad science. Now, the very same kind of difficulty occurs when you start talking about parallel universes or virtual universes. We have seen proposals in recent months that suggest that there might be a universe just like ours. That somewhere out there in some other dimension there might be a John Clayton standing in front of a camera preparing material for someone like you to look at, to motivate you to think, to look at your belief system, to answer the questions of the challenges, that might be going on someplace else, just like it is here. Well, that's creative. That's interesting. We talk about virtual universes. Maybe there are illusionary universes out there. But I want to say to you again, these are imaginative, they're creative, they're wonderful philosophical exercises, but they are not science. They cannot be tested. They cannot be falsified. Let's look at a different area. And the area I want to look at now is one that comes from a religious perspective. It's called intelligent design. Now, you're looking at a picture of a book that perhaps started this by a man by the name of Behe. It's called Darwin's Black Box. Behe suggested that Darwinism had certain things that it assumed that were not mathematically workable. That there were some things that exist in nature that are so complex that chance alone would not be a valid mechanism to explain what is taking place. Now, creationists, of course, religious people jumped on this because it was an opportunity to denigrate Charles Darwin's work and to suggest that evolutionary theory is all bogus. And there are wonderful things that have been done in this area. People have looked at the complexity of biological systems. In our discussion of design, I took you through a discussion of intelligent design using mathematical constants from physics, some of which you see on the screen right now. The question is this good science? And the answer is, it's not science at all. Intelligent design is not a way of doing science. We will not find a cure for cancer by the methods of intelligent design. We will not solve avian bird flu by the methods of intelligent design. Intelligent design is a wonderful apologetic. All right, what does that mean? It means that intelligent design can show us things in nature that when we look at them, we have to recognize that trying to assume this could occur without any intelligence behind it is a very unlikely situation and cannot be rationally believed by a thinking, intelligent human being. Now, obviously, people would have different opinions about that. But we have presented mountains of material that show you one example of the other. It isn't, though, occasionally we see something that demonstrates this, like, for instance, Behe's work with the flagella. But in every area of science, in physics, in astronomy, in geology, in all the different areas, in this video series, we have looked at examples of design. It speaks eloquently of the fact that we can know there is a God through the things He has made, Romans 1, beginning with verse 19. But that's an apologetic. It's an argument for the existence of God. It's a philosophical point. It's a religious point. It is not a method of doing science. And see, what the media has tried to do, and what some scientists have tried to do, and what happened in Dover, Delaware, was that the apologetic nature of intelligent design was confused with the methodology of doing science. It isn't falsifiable. It isn't testable. It is a question about the ultimate philosophical understanding of what drives what we see in nature. And many, many, many evolutionists are believers in God, because they believe evolution is simply a tool of God. And they look at that as an argument for the validity of their faith. Perhaps the classic example of that is Francis Collins, who is the director of the Human Genome Project during the height of his career. He has resigned recently from that position, retired from it more accurately. So intelligent design is another example of what I would suggest to you is not very good science. It's an apologetic. I'm not invalidating it, I'm not denigrating it, I'm simply saying it is not something that will offer a way of curing the scientific problems that we see in the world today. Let's look at another example in the scientific area of bad science. And actually, this is a question of methodology of doing science. Naturalism is not the same thing as evolution. The newspapers and atheist periodicals, and especially Richard Dawkins, but other people who are evolutionists, try to suggest to our young people that everything there is in the creation can be explained by science, that every question can be answered ultimately by science. Now that's a faith. It's a faith that suggests to us that everything that happens by accident, happens by chance, is not something that is intelligently driven by any force. Now, evolutionists will say, well, natural selection is not just accidental. Well, no. Natural selection works within confines of certain restrictions. In other words, let's talk about a rabbit who is brown and is all of a sudden in a snowy environment, and there's a mutation which knocks out his brown gene, and now he's an albino. So he is more advantaged to live in the polar environment. Okay, natural selection functioned there. Was it totally random? Well, no, because obviously it had to hit the right gene. Obviously, the rabbit had to be in a polar environment, a place where it was snowy, for natural selection to work. Obviously, there had to be a predator which would take advantage of the fact that a brown rabbit in a white environment is easy to see and catch. So in that sense, there is limitations upon the natural selection process, but the process still is not intelligently driven. Natural selection is a process that may be limited by the environmental conditions, but the question still remains, how did the genome become a part of the picture? What are the total factors involved in all the processes that enable this to take place? So confusing naturalism with evolution is an example of bad science. Evolution, the fact that living things can change by mutations in their genetic material is a fact. We discussed this in our video on evolution. That's not the issue. Does that equate to the concept that everything happens by mechanical accident, that naturalism is the only way in which things in the universe come into existence? The answer to that is absolutely not. That is an assumption. That is a religious base. It's not testable. It's not falsifiable. It's bad science. So it's important to look at the definitions of things. We've talked about the importance of understanding the definition of evolution, but in confusing naturalism with evolution is a major difficulty. All right, let's take a look at another example of bad science. One of the things happening in the scientific community today are investigations of the human brain. The human brain is an incredible computer. And in spite of discussions about artificial intelligence and so forth, the human brain still remains unique in its capacity to store data, in the way in which it functions, all of the things that have a part of the way in which we function. One of the areas that has been suggested about the human brain is the fact that maybe the brain is responsible for our soul. And as a matter of fact, there have been studies done of certain sections of the brain that people suggest might be what make people religious. Now, I want you to think about that suggestion for a minute. If you're suggesting that the human brain explains everything about us that is spiritual in nature, then what are you assuming about the spiritual makeup of man? And the answer to that, of course, is that you're assuming that everything that we do spiritually, everything we do religiously, is a function of our brain and therefore of our intelligence. You're suggesting that animals do not have this because they don't have that particular section of the brain. So wouldn't that suggest that if you did experiments or did examinations of, for instance, our so-called closest relatives, the apes, that you would see this capacity to develop in some way? And somebody says, well, maybe you just don't know how to recognize it. I've had people say to me, maybe monkeys pray. You don't know whether monkeys pray or not. The problem here is that science does not address itself to the question of what spiritual things are about. And this is one of those areas where the limits of science become an issue. What is a soul? In our discussion of the nature of man, way back when we talked about what is God and where did God come from in the earlier DVDs, one of the things we talked about was that a man's soul is that part of man which is created in the image of God. And that suggests to us that we have three components. We have a body, pretty obvious. We have breath, life force, which in the Hebrew was the word nephesh. But animals also have nephesh. And some translations of the Bible even refer to animal spirits, but that's the breath of the animal. And then there's this third component, which is that which is uniquely created in the image of God. What does that nature of man do? What does that soul of man do? Well, one of the things I suggested to you is that there are all kinds of experimental results which suggest that the spiritual part of man enables man to have values and to do things that animals do not do. Man's capacity to worship, man's ability to create and express himself in art, man's ability to express himself in music, man's capacity to feel guilt, to be sympathetic, all of the things that really uniquely define us as humans. Do animals do this progressively? Do we see, as we move from, say, an amoeba through, let's say, a chimpanzee, do we see a gradual development of these capabilities? One of the things I demonstrated to you was that when you start talking about ape art, for example, and I gave the example of Coco, the gorilla that has been taught the sign language of the deaf, and that the work with Penny Patterson with expressing himself in art, that was basically a conditioned response and did not show the type of creative capacity and growth capacity we see in human beings. Now, this is a question that has to do with the nature of us. What is man about? What does it mean to have a soul? And suggesting that this is going to be somehow discovered by a physical makeup of the brain is bad science. It's not testable. It's not falsifiable. There is no way that you could remove that part of the human brain and see if man has these capabilities, nor is there any experimental data that supports the idea that apes or other animals could do that to a degree. So there are limitations in science. And I go back to Einstein's statement. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. There are areas that have to do with the uniqueness of man that are not scientifically investigatable. There is no experiment we can conduct. There is nothing we can do to test whether man's capacity is something that should be carried on and used in a positive way with man. So experiments that are done in these areas have to be done by a consideration of what our spiritual values are about. May I suggest to you that this comes up in the question of cloning, and there's a classic example there. We've said in one of our discussions about biological issues that cloning is a wonderful tool. We may be able to take the ability to clone and clone organs that are cancerous so that the organ be removed, the clone organ put back in place. The new organ would function perfectly. It would not be rejected because it came from the person's own tissue. That's a wonderful potential tool. So cloning has wonderful possibilities. It may help us in solving our food problems. It may eliminate certain diseases. But the question remains, will we see people using it for things like the boys of Brazil? Cloning robots, cloning multiple Hitlers, if you remember that story. Using cloning as a way of producing androids or other science fiction type horror stories. Now, what determines the use to which cloning will be put? Will it be put to produce destructive things, bad things? Or will it be used to improve and address the problems of mankind? Science cannot determine the uses to which its discoveries will be placed. It is bad science to venture into these areas. So I would suggest to you, even Richard Dawkins' suggestion that there's no such thing as evil is bad science. It is moving science into an area that science is not equipped to address. Now, we've looked at some examples of bad science. There are, I'm sure, hundreds of others, some of which you may be able to think of and some of which you may have questions about, and you can certainly contact me if you have questions about them. But I would suggest to you, while there is bad science out there, there is also an enormous amount of bad theology. And I'm not suggesting stuff that is opinion-oriented. I don't pretend to have all the answers in any of these areas. But there are some areas where the theological bias of both atheists and believers has caused massive conflict between science and faith that is unnecessary and shouldn't be there. In one of our later presentations, we want to talk about bad theology. But there's one other area that we want to discuss here in the science area that is, I think, an important discussion, and that is quantum mechanics. Is quantum mechanics bad science? I've already said to you that that's not the case. Can it be falsified? To some extent it can be. Can it be tested? Yes, it can. And so in our next presentation, we want to try and help you understand, if you're not familiar with quantum mechanics, at a very elementary level, what it is about and how it impacts the question of creation and the whole concept of in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Does God Exist is an educational program which attempts to provide evidence that man can logically believe in God and that the Christian system presented in the New Testament is the best option for successful living. We offer materials free and on loan. Contact us by mail, fax, or email for a catalog, to request materials, or just to ask questions. Does God exist may be the most important question you will ever ask.